I'm Richard Rubenstein. My colleague Christopher Mitchell and I have come from the United States to interview John Burton here in Canberra. We work at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, which is a place that John Burton had a great deal to do with. He was one of the founders and a guiding spirit of our institute. And he has functioned to both of us as a teacher, a mentor, role model, and friend. And so we're very happy to be here interviewing John. John Burton was a student at the University of Sydney and at Melbourne and then at London. He became involved with the Australian government as Secretary to Department of External Affairs and a delegate to the UN Charter Conference in 1945. In 1947, John became permanent head of the Australian Foreign Office, the youngest person ever to hold that job. And in 1951, he became High Commissioner to Ceylon. Beginning in the early 50s, John went into academic life, first as a teacher at Australian National University, a Rockefeller grantee, and then in the early 60s at University College London, where he founded the Center for the Analysis of Conflict in 1963. John was at the University of Kent from 1979 on as a director of the Center for the Analysis of Conflict there. And in the early 80s, we were lucky enough to get him in the United States, where he came to, at first to the University of Maryland to run the Center for Development and Conflict Resolution, and then in the mid-80s to George Mason University, where he became associated with the Center for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, which is currently the Institute. Beginning at an early period in his academic career, John began to write a number of books, some of which have become classics in the fields of peace studies and conflict resolution. I won't name all of them, but some of them are Peace Theory, International Relations, a General Theory, System States, Diplomacy and Rules. Conflict and Communication is one of the first and most important conflict resolution books. World Society established a new model of international relations based on the so-called cobweb model instead of the nation-state model. A book called Deviance, Terrorism and War, not John's title, but the publisher's title, introduced the theory of basic human needs to our field, and then followed Global Conflict, a series of 4 volumes in the Conflict series published by Macmillan St. Martin's Press in New York in 1990, Resolving Deep-Rooted Conflict, a handbook, and in 97, Violence Explained. These books, in many respects, are the basic books in the field of conflict analysis and resolution, and so it's a great pleasure and honor for us to be in Canberra today to be able to interview John Burton. At this point, I'm going to turn the interview over to Chris Mitchell, who's going to begin the questioning of John and conversation with him.
Okay. John, I think that there are many people in Australia who remember you as a diplomat and as a political figure, but I think there are probably fewer who know that you had a distinguished career as a scholar over in Britain and later in the United States. So most of the interview is going to concentrate on your career as an academic, but just to go back a little bit to your first career, I've often wondered whether there was, in that time when you were a diplomat, though I think possibly an unusual diplomat, was there anything that happened, or there was any particular point in time, perhaps at the San Francisco conference or thereafter, when you became dissatisfied with the thinking that was underpinning the way in which conflicts were dealt with?
I don't think I finally resigned. I don't think it was because I was dissatisfied with the way in which things have been dealt with. I had been in this office during the war over 10 years, working virtually day and night, and I needed the break. I stayed here while the government changed, and it was a year or so before I resigned, and I felt I needed a break from that career.
And then when you entered at the academic world, which I did at the same time, except that you were a professor and I was an undergraduate, it was the beginning of what I suppose you could call the field of conflict analysis or conflict resolution, though we tended to call it conflict research around about that time. Who were some of the other major figures in it that you were working with in England at that period, and who, if anybody, influenced your thinking at that time?
Well, I'd have to go back a few years earlier than that.
Okay.
I attended some pugwash conferences. These pugwash conferences, started by a Canadian, were conferences of those who had been involved in creating the atomic bomb, nuclear physicists. They were meeting together with a guilt complex, I think, trying to agree, the Russians and Americans and British in particular, trying to agree on ways in which they could get rid of atomic weapons. Sir Marcus Oliphant from Australia was amongst this group because he had been involved, and he invited me to join one of these conferences because they were realizing by then that they couldn't, as physicists, come to a conclusion on these matters. So I went to one of these, and I was not surprised, I suppose, but a bit concerned that the whole framework was the old traditional framework of power politics. They wanted to get rid of this type of weapon, but there was no suggestion of getting rid of any other weapons, and the idea of power, balances of power keeping the peace, or a superpower keeping the peace, prevailed. I came back somewhat disgusted and wrote Peace Theory with a subtitle, Preconditions of Disarmament. I went back to another pugwash conference, this time it was in Oxford, and tried to put some views forward, and it was like talking to a deaf audience. I couldn't understand what I was talking about, because in those days power politics absolutely dominated the field. It was after one of these conferences that I met the Baldines, Elise, and was very active, and Kenneth too. And they introduced me to a professor of international law at the University College London.
Georg Schwarzenberger. Georg?
Yeah, this is a guy, Schwarzenberger. And he asked me if I'd start teaching in a course in international relations within his section of the Department of Law. And it was quite clear he'd just written a book on power politics. It was quite clear he wanted me to use that as a text. I didn't hesitate about it because I thought, well, this is the conventional wisdom. I have to start here at any rate and move step by step in another direction if this is possible. And I hadn't thought enough about it to be clear in my own mind. I'd been brought up in a power politics frame. The Charter Conference at San Francisco was power politics. Security Council with the veto the great powers had, and so on. So I started teaching, and little by little moved from one position to another.
Well, you started teaching in '63, but I mean, your time in London, it wasn't just teaching, because I remember you were also very instrumental in starting, among other things, the Conflict Research Society, and also the International Peace Research Association. You were associated with that. You were Bert Rawlings.
That's right. Yes, I was active in the International Studies Association and so on. And I got involved too with industrial relations. I was a consultant to a firm of consultants on industrial relations, and gradually moved out of the narrow definition of international relations. But I ran into major trouble in 1971 when I wrote the book, which I called Solving Unsolved Problems. The publishers called Deviance, Terrorism and War. In it, I suggested that deterrence does not deter, that there are more basic needs that can't be deterred, and therefore you couldn't get rid of wars unless, and wars which could be won by the more powerful, followed by a peace which would be won by those who had been defeated, who still had their needs to be satisfied. And of course we'd had the example of Korea and Vietnam, and even the war of Japan joined Hitler after 18 months because of British colonialism. Britain lost its colonies and Japan became a fairly significant economic power. So that caused furor in London, in England. There were meetings of all teachers of international relations throughout England condemning this attack on power politics. They'd all have to change their lecture notes if they'd adopted this. And so I was challenged to take a conflict situation and demonstrate that there were alternatives to power politics, which led to my first involvement.
Okay, I wasn't part of that, but I do remember that you seemed to draw very heavily on some of your colleagues at the Tavistock Institute. Do you remember Eric Trist and Fred Emery, I think, were part of that whole pre-planning for your first effort, weren't they?
Well, it was hardly an institute that wasn't a bit hostile, because it was threatening all their procedures, all their basic assumptions, and it was threatening the whole processes of negotiation, bargaining, and behind-the-scenes use of power. So there was a lot of opposition at the time, and it was quite clear that we had to be able to demonstrate there was an option. And fortunately, I was able to get hold of a situation which had been in the public eye more or less, and apply our processes.
Tell us a little bit about the thinking behind the development of the process. I mean, eventually, I think you called it controlled communication, but at that stage, it was very much an experimental process, wasn't it?
Well, I had never been involved, and this challenge, I suppose, was very helpful because it forced me to get involved and get a process operating. Harold Wilson had tried to intervene in a conflict in Southeast Asia and invited the three leaders concerned to meet with him in London, and they all refused, because for a leader to be talking to the opposition was a sign of weakness. And after this had failed, I wrote to him and asked him if he'd have any objections if we called these parties together. In a letter obviously dictated by him, he said, "Be my guest, go ahead." And he appointed a backbench member to keep in touch with me and him. And so we, in the ordinary processes of communication, asked the three leaders concerned each to nominate three people.
Did you know these guys before, the three leaders?
No.
Did they know you?
I suppose that they knew of me because I'd been in touch with these countries as for my position in the Foreign Affairs Department. However, within 10 days, all three sent representatives. And we met for best part of 2 weeks.
This was in London?
It was in London.
Okay, and what were the three were Indonesia?
Well, I wasn't mentioning the names, but Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore.
Okay. I mean, I think you've written about this, so I don't think there's any need to be secret.
In a journal, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an emotional experience for me. I constantly recall it because it was so new, out of this world. Here these three came together. They wouldn't look at each other. They turned their chairs to face the panel 4 or 5 that I'd gathered together as a third party. And we invited each one of them one by one to state their position. And they were as aggressive as it could be. And then we asked, after each one had stated the position, we invited the others to ask questions of them, but the questions must not be to provoke, they must be genuine questions. And this went on, of course took some considerable time. And then we started asking questions, asking the parties to explain this, explain that, exactly what do they mean when they said this, and so on and so on. And little by little, took days, they started shifting their chairs around and looking at each other, facing each other. By the end of the week, they were just about ignoring the third party. They were communicating directly. And it totally changed their attitude. They recognized others as being humans too, with the same kinds of concerns, same kinds of insecurity, worries. They've been fighting over boundaries and territory. In due course, I realized it had nothing to do with boundaries and territory. They all had a common concern. They were mainly worried about foreign interventions, and particularly the activities of Chinese businessmen who were in all this area and really running the countries. And they were fearful of this. But little by little by little, they were able to define exactly what the problems were. And in due course, they felt that there was nothing more to say, so they went home. After about 10 days, I hadn't heard from them, so I sent messages saying, is there anything else we can do? And I got replies back in identical terms, which was to indicate to me they are now back in diplomatic relations. No announcements were made, no announcements of any agreement were made. The whole thing was in confidence. They were asked not to make any public statements, and their leaders shouldn't make any public statements, but merely pursue policies which would alter the relationships. Within a few days, fighting stopped, and there seemed to be no problems after that. That achieved my purpose with my colleagues. I was tolerated for a while after that, but it led us as a centre to pursue other situations. We went from one to another after that.
So you met the challenge, answered it, and therefore your ideas were better tolerated in the UK, or was there still the same hostility?
They still required enunciation, which is why I suppose I wrote so much. The concepts had to be spelled out. Power politics has made certain assumptions, and I had to, the book to which I referred, Solving Unsolved Problems, referred to human needs. Now, these weren't needs of territory or clothing or food or something. These were needs of a role in society, the individual needs in the society or the national needs in the world society, national role, basic needs of this order. And this all had to be spelled out and explained before I could have much communication with my colleagues. And I must say, as you were one of the students played a very active part in this. I moved from power politics to using books that I had written, and at the end of the year I would give a series of lectures, and at the end of the year have to change all these in the view of the comments made from the classes, and the next year I'd be teaching from the same notes but in quite different orientation. And by the end of the second year, I was ready to publish what I'd written and move to the next step. And I couldn't repeat to students what had been written, so I was moving little by little from one thesis to a more explicit statement in another book. And that, I think, explains why I wrote about 14 books about this time.
Well, Rich referred to some of them. I can assure you, as one of your students at that time, it was very confusing for us. You were starting, when I began, your critique of power politics, and of course none of us, when we first came in, knew what the hell power politics was, so we didn't quite know what you were critiquing. Let me go on a little bit now, though, because the first exercise that you did, which was a pioneering effort, was the one over confrontation. Then we did one on Cyprus, and then you got involved in something much nearer at home in Northern Ireland. And I know that you did a lot of work in Northern Ireland in the early 70s. Were you beginning to develop your theories of human needs and applying them to that particular dispute? I mean, I know you and Joe Camplison did a lot of work behind the scenes in that particular province, but was it all within the framework of human needs?
You're asking me all these questions about situations which I've refrained from writing about. However, the answer to your question is yes. I was able to bring parties together who had never been in the same room before, never in the same town together before. And I did a lot of silly things. I walked from a Protestant area to a Catholic area to interview a leader of a particular party, and I was warned that this was a dangerous thing to do. I had searchlights on me from the army. I didn't know, couldn't quite understand what I was on about, but I used to go and talk to them fairly regularly. One of the staff of the commander was a former student of mine, which helped a bit. But I realized in retrospect I should never have done this. When I did go to see this man who was in charge of the military section, there were at least 5 or 6 people standing round him with guns. However, we got into a very useful conversation, and I was able to continue relationships with both sides, and then set about trying to get them in direct dialogue.
Mm-hmm. But this was also the time when you were beginning to think in systems terms and also developing ideas about human needs. Did the Northern Ireland situation strike you as being an example of the existence of unfilled needs, or how did that all come together in your mind?
Well, I guess I was assuming that there were some needs there that had to be revealed, and they weren't revealed until the parties got together. But obviously the Catholics felt they'd been treated as second-class citizens and were very resentful, and standards of living there weren't as high as elsewhere. The man that you mentioned, Kemperson, missed out on any education at all. He had to spend time going from family to family and trying to find kids which had been separated in all this conflict and get families joined together again. So a lot of that kind of work went on. There was a centre in Northern Ireland created by the government, by Westminster, to try to deal with these issues. And I spent a lot of time there, and by accident we used to have meetings between Protestants and Catholics. We'd have a Protestant there, and by accident a Catholic would happen to come in, and this had very productive results. But the Paisley group resented this, and the centre was finally folded up.
And as Richard's pointed out, during all of this time you were writing, and as you've said, you wrote, I don't know whether it was 14, but it was somewhere near that number of books. Intellectually, though, you were always somewhat outside the mainstream of British international relations and conflict thinking, but was there anybody whose work you found useful at this time, or who sparked ideas off in your mind? And I remember very vividly that one of the books that you made us read was Karl Deutsch's Nerves of Government, which we could never see at the time what that had to do with conflict. Subsequently I realized what you were getting at, but only subsequently.
Yes, Deutsch's book was very influential for me. But at that stage there wasn't much at all. It was only later, particularly when I was in the States, that I discovered all kinds of sources which were stimulating. And I was glad when I produced the 4 volumes, when I spent the year at the U.S. Institute of Peace, to be able to include a volume with articles by various people with whom I'd worked and who had been very important in my own thinking, both initially and later on.
I remember one of the first public lectures I ever heard you give in University College. I think you entitled it The Resolution of Conflict by Casework. I think you'd been reading a lot of casework studies at that time. Did that or the tabby mob have an impression on you at all?
Casework was widespread as a term which was understood. It was bringing mainly individuals together, or perhaps unions and workers or something, and employers. And I suppose I used the term because it was familiar with people, and I was saying, instead of having bargaining and negotiation, there can be an analysis with the parties brought together.
Well, we're sort of moving on to your time in the United States, so let me hand over to my colleague here, who got to know you, I guess, slightly later than your first trip to the United States. But Rich, do you want to?
Yes. I wanted to go back, in fact, before the United States, even, John, I wanted to ask you about, especially for people who aren't as familiar with your work as we are, when you talk about repudiating power politics, the power politics approach, even today at our institute, when we talk in these same terms, the students and other teachers on campus, when they get a chance to hear us, say, what on earth are they talking about? What do they mean repudiating? Isn't power politics reality? The people who adhere to that view call themselves realists. and I know that from time to time, some have called you a utopian. Are you a utopian?
I understand what they're saying, and power politics does still dominate. Britain lost its role as the leading power as a result of World War II, and now the United States is exercising its role as the most powerful country and intervening all over the place, in my view, doing more harm than good, in the sense that the tendency is to try to impose a kind of Westminster or similar situation on countries and on indigenous people who have got long traditions. And so the United States have become the colonial power of the world, so power politics is still there alive. And in that sense, the realists are right. I've just read a book produced by strategists. They would say they're right that you need the power political system. In my view, I made a comment to the book and wrote to those sponsoring it, saying you're asking for World War III. This is the kind of document, together with increased weaponry, which would scare China. You're going to, the relationships with China and other countries are going to deteriorate. You might call the alternative approach utopian, but humanity has to make this choice. Whether it's going along this adversarial road in all its institutions and its relations, or whether it could become a bit more constructive. I think it's a pretty depressing picture, really. I don't think we've achieved much in conflict resolution, except in particular cases. We haven't got a consensus change in viewpoints. In one book I used the term prevention. We know what prevention is: more police in the streets and more soldiers to do this, that and the other thing. We don't have a concept of trying to get the source of problems and seeing that they don't emerge. And we need this concept of prevention to be developed. Now you could call it utopian, I suppose, but there's not much option. And the picture could be very depressing, and I feel today quite depressed, not so much emotionally as intellectually, about what's going on, with more wars in the globe than we've ever had before, probably, because we haven't yet understood the way in which different tribes, races, religions are wanting to secure their role. They've got a need for their individual and national and associates to have some standing, and for us to go into Fiji and elsewhere and say, unless you become Westminster democracies, we'll impose sanctions, is quite ridiculous. We ought to have been studying the traditions which have led Fijians in this way in their combat with Indians who were brought in by the colonists, the colonial power, to do the agricultural work on the islands. So I don't mind being called utopian as long as the others will recognize that they're a total disaster.
John, when you talk about alternatives to power politics, those alternatives take several related forms. You often have spoken about solving problems that generate conflict, as a way of dealing with the root causes of the conflict and preventing it or resolving it. And you also have made a move away from considering international relations as an affair of states, of nation states, and towards an attempt to consider the human aspects of conflict and individuals and their needs as a basis for conflict. One of the reasons that you've been called a utopian sometimes, and I too, in a recent article that condemns us both, I don't know if I've shown it to you yet, as utopians, by a conservative philosopher who says these people at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution don't understand that people are not basically good, that they are basically aggressive, and that if they will seek power, it's in their nature to seek power, and if they're not stopped by superior power, they'll seek power indefinitely. This man, who's at Boston College, goes on to say that Burton and Rubinstein and others underestimate people's capacity for evil, but also their capacity for good. They don't recognize that man can be diabolical or man can be saintly. Is that, and therefore they question the theory of human needs.
Well, this is a criticism of humanity and human intelligence. We're still in the days of early feudalism. There are the landlords and serfs in the industrial area. All our institutions are adversarial. Party politics. You only have to listen to Question Time or the nonsense which goes on in your Congress to realize it's an adversarial system where you debate, you don't discuss. Then you move to industry, and you've got management and robots. Workers are not treated as individuals with their own role as humans. You get into the legal system. Lord Lloyd, who's in charge of this University of London college we're talking about, wrote a book in which he said, there are those who have the right to govern and others who have an obligation to obey. And this is still the thinking of many people. Now, as I say, this is a criticism of humanity. Doesn't the human being have enough intelligence to know that the inevitable consequence of this is disaster? We've had 2 world wars. The next world war, with all the weapons now available to all kinds of countries, will be an absolute disaster. And that's where they're leading us. I agree that this might be a bit unrealistic, that considering options, but at least it's an intelligent attempt to get humanity out of the evolutionary trends which have dominated so far. We've had the odd person who advocates some different approach, and we have the Gandhis and all kinds of people that crop up, but their influence is limited too, because they're talking within this adversarial framework. And I think that the purpose of conflict resolution studies is really, apart from dealing with particular situations, is to bring together different disciplines We've got economics that couldn't care a damn about the person. If you happen to be unemployed, it might be good to means of controlling inflation, but the human aspects are not taken into account. Even sociology is more concerned with the maintenance of the institutions of society than the welfare of the individual and the group and the community. I did psychology. I learnt nothing about the person. I learnt about reflexes and instincts and IQs and one thing and another, but very little about the person and the values the person has and the needs the person has. And you go to a psychiatrist, and I've never tried it out, but I guess a psychiatrist will try to help the patient adjust to the conditions. Very little attempt to change the conditions which have led to the problem in the first place. I think Galton made an important contribution when he introduced the notion of structural violence. The structures of society, the institutions of society, and the traditions violate the person. And the conservative approach is to defend existing structures and not to change them. And I think that these people that you're talking about are probably conservative in this sense. Let's improve our weapons, our defense forces, and so on. And of course, the more any country does this, the more others fear, the more they'll do it, and so it goes on.
So you're saying that we need a theory of the person that makes more sense, like the theory of human needs, and also a theory of the situation that generates the non-fulfillment of the needs. And that's produced two lines of questioning and some criticism of these theories, and lots of questions. One line has to do with the human needs themselves. Some people have asked, if there are a limited number of basic human needs that require to be satisfied if violence is to be avoided, why is it so difficult to identify what those needs are? There's some disagreement among human needs theorists about what the needs are. And what do you think the basic needs are, and how can we arrive at agreement on this?
It's something that hasn't really been thought about much, and I've had difficulty trying to define precisely human needs. Identity, recognition, whether it be the person or the community or the religious group or whatever it is, is very important to the individual. If you have no role at all in society, then you know more than an electric robot does. You're not a person. And we've got so many people in societies that either are out of a job or are excluded from the community for one reason or another, who haven't found any role. My hunch is that a good deal of our problem with drugs and theft and all kinds of other problems society has relate to this. You find groups of people that haven't a role in society coming together to form gangs. And in a gang, you can have a role. You can go and boast that you've done this, that, or the other thing. And I can't define human needs. It's something we ought to be thinking far more about, getting together different disciplines and trying to get a more useful concept than just human needs itself. It's a very difficult problem, but it seems to me the essential one that we have to tackle. Because this is what you discover when you have parties to disputes together. They'll start out very antagonistic. And it doesn't matter whether one's more powerful than the other. little by little, when they start cross-examining each other, they discover they've got all the same goals. And the goals relate to their security, their role, their status. And once they've discovered this, then they start talking about how can we both achieve this. It's very revealing when you get parties together like this. And it makes the more powerful party realize that the use of power is not going to do anything to resolve the problem, and power becomes irrelevant. And as I said earlier, we've had examples of very, very small countries defeating major powers.
Yes, one of the things we're finding about, you mentioned power and U.S. interventions and so forth earlier, is that the most difficult situation, if we're trying to talk needs and to talk about the necessity of finding the causes of the conflict and dealing with them, is when a figure comes on the scene like Saddam Hussein or Milosevic or one of the nationalist bullies.
And a regime like the Taliban.
Sure, or the Taliban, but if the United States especially decides to demonize them even more than they've demonized themselves, and begins to whip up the sentiment that we have to use force to stop these. You can't talk about conflict resolution until you use force to stop these aggressors. Then we're back in the old power politics paradigm again, but it's very hard to resist that, and our students find it very hard to resist that appeal.
Why are these people in power? Hassan, have you read his life history? Both parents committed suicide. He was isolated. He made good, he went to Cairo and got some education and so on. But he has to be described as a fairly neurotic person. And when I was talking about adversarial relationships and party politics and so on, I should have referred to leaderships. Leaderships frequently, particularly what we call strong leaders, are just neurotic people. And you can go back into their background. You get the weak leader, like Attlee and here Chifley. No one would write them up as strong leaders. They were men of integrity. They couldn't be pushed around. They would be consulting all their colleagues. They didn't take so-called strong actions unless there was some situation which clearly required it, and then only after consultation, consideration. And I think one of our main problems in electing leaders is we're electing people who've got all kinds of deficiencies. I don't want to be too personal, but you had a president who was regarded as a weak person, and he wanted to demonstrate this wasn't so. So he got the army involved in the Gulf. The head of the chiefs of staff resigned over it because he knew it was not the appropriate thing to do. So when you get a leadership like this, threats and occupations and sanctions and so on, they don't do anything. They tend to enable the leader to bring the people in his support, because the people also are threatened. The thing to do is to get hold of them and try to work out with them just what their problems are and how they can be overcome and so on. It makes the consultation process even more important than in a usual conflict. And usually when you get parties involved in conflicts, you come across this problem. I can recall one situation where after about 4 or 5 days of discussion, one chap says, the problem's our leaders. These were for people who had been nominated by leaders, and everyone around the table laughed. They all agreed. And they had to go home, of course, and say to their leaders, here's an outcome which is acceptable, and without any policy announcements or anything or changes in direction, you have to go along with it. And almost always in a conflict situation, you come up across this leadership problem. But again, we come back to needs. If these people had had a decent upbringing and opportunities, they wouldn't be behaving like this.
John, your comments produce two kinds of practical questions for me. One has to do with the specific process that you're strongly identified with as a way of getting the leaders to, and non-leaders as well, to deal with the problems and recognize them, which is the problem-solving workshop. And I think Chris wants to ask you some questions about that. And then either before or after that, I would like also to ask you if the problem turns out to be systemic, and you yourself said a little while ago that sometimes the system needs to be changed in order to get rid of the problem, to solve the problem, whether that implies some sort of political movement, whether that can be done by the leaders alone, or how, in fact, that kind of change is to take place. But let me turn it back to Chris to talk about the workshops or whatever else he wants to.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's an interesting theme because, you know, if you're associated with a number of aspects of this new field of conflict analysis and resolution, and I think it is new, one of the major ones is the workshop, the problem-solving workshop. So can you say a little bit about how you developed that idea in the first place? I mean, where did the ideas come from? Where did you suddenly where did you suddenly think it is necessary to get people, nominees, round a table for such and such a time with a panel? I mean, how did you develop that?
Well, as I said earlier, I was provoked to do it. I had no intention, never occurred to me. And then I got this challenge from all the academic community in the UK. I took the risk, I suppose, and I'm not quite sure what the terms are, but I was a bit cheeky, I suppose, in writing to Wilson, the Prime Minister. And it just took off from there. We went from one situation to another.
How did it change as you went from one situation to the other? And what did you learn from the first one to the second to the other series?
Well, I think you learn a lot with each situation. It worries me that there are so many people teaching this subject who haven't had this experience, which I thought was quite an emotional experience. It gave me the insights which I could not possibly have had before. Maybe that's just me, that I don't know enough about people. I think it was virtually accident, virtually those circumstances which led me in this direction. And of course this changed my writing. I started writing about processes, and I realized how important processes were. You must have off-the-record discussions. As soon as that parties would meet, I'd say, look here, this is in confidence. No public statements at all. Not now, not in the future. And I said not in the future because if they made public the fact that they had gone through this, even quietly, others that we approached would say, oh no, in 2 or 3 years' time, it'll all come out. And so we used to have to insist that no discussion. And as you said, I referred to one situation in an article. I was a bit reluctant to do it, but it was
25 years ago.
25, 30 years afterwards. The situation changed. Unfortunately, of course, when politicians do this, they want the publicity and the credits, and this destroys the whole process.
That does lead to one problem, though, or at least to several problems, one of which is the fact that if you keep it confidential, then in fact it's difficult to convince people that this is a good, useful, practical process. But let's leave that one on one side for the moment. The other one is one that you've already referred to with regard to the leaders, because there is always this problem which I think our old friend Herb Kelman has referred to as the re-entry problem. People go through this experience, and as you say, it's an intensely emotional experience, an intensely change-bringing experience, and then they have the problem of going back and confronting their leaders, and presumably not just their leaders, but the leaders' opposition. And a lot of people have said, well, of course, you can bring change to those who come, but how do they transmit that change, and how do you know they've transmitted the change? I mean, you've obviously had lots of practical experience of that. How would you deal with that problem?
Well, it's something that always comes up in the discussions themselves. No public statements, shifts in policy, communication between them, and as they pursue altered policies. And at the end of one of these sessions, you usually spend a day or so discussing these matters, and they try to come to some agreed processes whereby they can do this. But I agree, it's a difficult process, and it frequently might mean quite fundamental changes in approaches. I think that Australia's intervention into Timor was very unfortunate. There could have been an interaction resulting in quite a different outcome, a degree of autonomy, but still within the total framework. And this wouldn't have been so difficult to sell as the situation which was imposed on them. No, none of this is easy, and you can't be successful all the time. It's much easier, of course, at lower levels, in industrial relations and family relations and so on. Some communication is possible outside.
Well, let's push that one a bit further, because one of the things that I think has happened in the field over the last decade is there's been a major shift in the way people write about the use of problem-solving approaches. And the big slogan at the moment is that you have to problem solve not just at the leadership level or the elite level, but also at the grassroots level and opinion leaders level. I mean, this is not a particularly new idea. I mean, Herb has been doing it at opinion leader levels. Do you have any reaction to the idea that you have to bring the grassroots along as well, rather than operating at the elite level?
Oh, of course. And frequently, these conflicts involve the grassroots level in particular. But more directly, it seems to me now there's an urgent need in the developed countries for different income levels, social levels to come together and try to foresee the future and the consequences if nothing's done about it. If the rich go on getting richer and the poor go on getting poorer, we're going to have terrible clashes, particularly in countries where there are minorities of different ethnic background or religion or something.
Do you want to go back to Richard's question?
Well, you know, John, what you just said provokes another one for me. A lot of people are now saying with the near collapse, or maybe it's a full collapse of the Middle East peace process, Well, the people are saying, now how do you conflict resolution people explain this? Doesn't this prove that there's something defective in your approach to this issue? What should we learn from this Middle East?
Well, first of all, you learn that you don't get a leader that wants the political credit to take the initiative.
But they all do, unfortunately.
Yeah. For the leaders on either side to have to go back home without a formal agreement of any kind and be accused of selling out, put them in an impossible position that to then be seen to be tough. So the conflict escalates. If it had been done not involving the leaders but nominees of the leaders in a quiet way, and each problem had been tackled, then it would have been possible perhaps for the leaders to carry public opinion or sufficient public opinion with them to do something about it. Clearly, Israel has to make some major concessions. It can't go on behaving as it is. If it thinks because it's more militarily powerful that it can get away with it, it's got another thing coming. And that could escalate with more and more violence over a long period of time, and other countries joining in. It's a kind of situation which could lead to far wider global conflict than just the Middle East there.
Well, also, as I understand it, part of the philosophy of this peace process was that if you dealt with the easy issues first, the easier issues first, you would develop trust between the parties and momentum that would lead you eventually to, that would make the more difficult issues like the settlers on the West Bank, or the right of return of Palestinians and so forth, easier to, status of Jerusalem easier to handle.
If you analyze a situation and separate easier, quote, issues from others, you're almost saying that you're in a bargaining, negotiation situation. You have to take the situation as a whole. You get down to the sources which are not issues in debate. If you went to the Palestinians and say, now what are the issues? They'll say Jerusalem, this, that, and the other thing. These are not the real issues. If you get into an industrial conflict, the issue appears to be wage bargaining. Frequently, it's nothing to do with wages. It's to do with attitudes, conditions of work, and the way in which employees are treated on the floor. So you can't separate the easy from the not easy. You take the situation as a whole and work toward finding the sources of the problem. And then the so-called easy issues take on a different perspective altogether. Frequently they don't even get discussed because they're not real issues.
And how do you feel about the matter of whether one should in a bargaining negotiation framework, very often you're working with the moderates on both sides to try to reach an agreement, and the extremists, as they're called, are excluded. Is that any different in a problem-solving framework?
I think it's important when you're getting parties together to make sure that the communities are represented. It's quite important to have the extremists involved to some degree. It's not always possible to make a selection of people. You don't know enough about the situations to know who are the extremists or not. And I think that the parties concerned, when they do start discussion, themselves know who the extremists are and what the likely responses are going to be and so on. You can't afford to separate the communities. If the extremists are causing the problem, It's absurd to exclude them from the discussions.
John, this leads, I think, to a more general question, which is, you said that you were intellectually depressed about the extent of conflict in the world and our difficulty in gaining acceptance for conflict resolution, some basic ideas. What do you think needs to be done to move this field ahead now?
I don't know. I wish I knew the answer. I think it has to go ahead as it is at the moment. Your centre started as the only centre in this field, and now there are not many major universities that are not teaching courses in conflict resolution in one form or another. And there are many, many centres scattered right through the world community. In due course, the ideas, I suppose, will spread, but that's a long process. We're not going to really get there until we have teaching right from the primary level on about relationships and conflict resolution. We need courses for parents. We need management courses and so on. It has to become part of consensus thinking. But all our institutions are geared in the opposite direction. The so-called capitalist system, economic rationalist capitalist system, which during the war we called fascism, has attracted a lot of people who want to make a lot of money quickly, regardless of consequences for others. And if you think about the system and try to get it changing, the idea of smaller government, handing over to the market, to my mind is just a disaster. How could you have a community working together in a harmonious way if we have our education system geared toward being adversarial? I'm all right, Jack, to hell with the rest. I think the trends are going against the way which we would like to see them, despite trying to promote the idea of conflict resolution. It's this which I find very depressing. Not merely the international situation, but the domestic situations. I think you in the United States are going to be in for a lot of trouble in the future, as we will be here. And the problem globally is that conflict within a country spills over. It's almost impossible to have a major conflict within a country without attracting support or opposition elsewhere. And I suppose the most important conflict to resolve are those that are domestic ones. We have to get into a situation where we have far more bottom-up decision-making rather than top-down. Get people involved, and in this way give people a sense that they are involved and a sense of role in society. And I can't see this happening, and that's why I get depressed.
Suppose you could go back, knowing what you know now, to London in 1963. What do you think you might do differently, or what do you think you would change, or what have you learned that would alter what you would do?
I guess I wouldn't have done anything differently, for the reason that everything I've done has been by accident. One thing leads to another. I've only applied for one job in my life, and something happens, and something happens, and something happens. equally with thinking. You're considering something, you're writing a book, and all of a sudden something happens, or you read something else, and you shift. So I don't think you've got the option of doing things differently. You pursue a line. I suppose I was dedicated in a certain direction because of early upbringing and so on. And the revelations I had when I was doing my PhD thesis, I'll mention this briefly. I went to an ISA conference in Burton when I was writing a thesis about constructive and destructive intervention. The conference had to close because war was obviously going to break out in a couple of days. There were two very senior Japanese economists there. They handed out their papers. They go back to London and I'll read them. And they said absolutely categorically, if British colonial policy persists and excludes us, a small island with a large population, from markets and raw materials and so on, we have no option but to join with Hitler. 18 months later, of course, they joined with Hitler. And in retrospect, they won, as I suggested. Britain lost all its colonies and Japan became a very industrialized country. So I don't think you can talk about doing things differently. You respond to whatever stimuli that are there. You can look back and regret the odd mistake you made. You had a choice and you took the wrong step. I've done that fairly frequently. But by and large, I think that you're bound by the circumstances. And if I went back to London in '63, I could just trace out step by step how one thought led to another and one book led to another, and then something happens within the university, so you move to Kent, and then you're on retirement, so you've got no option, so you move to the United States where you don't retire till you die. So I went on.
All right, John, here's really the last one. Supposing you had a 23-year-old junior lecturer here just starting in the field, what advice would you give that person about what questions need to be looked at, what research needs to be done, what writing needs to be carried out, what theories need to be investigated? What's the next stage for the field of conflict analysis and resolution?
Well, you're talking to an 85-year-old. The world has changed. I couldn't advise people on what to do now. The global system's changed. It is a world society. The book I wrote on systems, structures, diplomacy and rules or something rather, wouldn't apply today. And so I think you have to say to your young people, think about where you think you can go and what are the circumstances and what are the values you want to pursue, etc., and turn it over to them rather than tell them what the issues are. We have been talking about human needs. I think that's an issue that really needs thinking about, discussing. And I think lecturers in this area need to be emphasizing very much the kinds of perceptual processes and changes which take place when parties are brought together. But I would hesitate to advise at this stage. I read journals and the language is different. I don't understand what's been said half the time.
That's all right. We don't know.
John, thank you for submitting to this interview. Listening to you give the answers makes me realize why I'm in this field, and I think Chris feels the same as I do about that. Thank you.